Before we jump into today's episode, I want to tell you about something new and something cool that we just made for you. I wrote it myself. Now, here's my assumption. If you are listening to this podcast, it probably means that you want to build long-term wealth with a rental real estate portfolio, and you would probably like to do it with some creative financing. And as I talk to people who want to do that, I know a lot of questions come up, and I thought there's really no great single resource that really captures the entire picture of how that works. But I have solved that problem because I have written a new PDF that is just for you, and it's called the Step-by-Step Guide to Buying Your First or Next Rental Property Without Relying on a Lender to Approve You for a Loan. Like I said, I wrote this thing myself, and if I do say so myself, it's pretty thorough. And in this, you're going to learn a few things. I'm going to teach you about the 3 key strategies to find and negotiate quality off-market real estate deals that nobody else even knows are for sale. I'm going to teach you about what I call the yeses framework for getting off-market sellers to accept your offers. And then I'm also going to teach you the 11 simple steps that you need to take to get your first or your next deal accepted without needing to go to a bank and apply for a loan and just hope that they give it to you. So if you would like to get this free downloadable PDF, just go to rentalwealthguide.com and you can download it right now. rentalwealthguide.com and get your download of the step-by-step guide to buying your first or next rental property without relying on a lender to approve you for a loan. Now, on with the show.
Successful real estate investing isn't all about we buy houses and motivated sellers. That's the lowbrow approach, and it gives real estate investing a slimy reputation. Gross. There is a better way, a more genuine, human approach. We are thoughtful real estate entrepreneurs, and this is sleaze-free real estate investing.
This is Jeff from the Thoughtful Real Estate Entrepreneur. Welcome to episode number 14 of Sleaze-Free Real Estate Investing. This is a show for those of us who never really felt at home in the we buy houses crowd. And in this show, we take a stand against what we call the lowbrow approach, the mainstream guru seminar, distressed seller approach that ends up giving real estate investors a slimy reputation. And instead, we discuss the strategies, tactics, and philosophies that we call the thoughtful way, an enlightened approach to real estate entrepreneurship that focuses on constantly sharpening the sophisticated real estate entrepreneur's 3 most critical capabilities: seller relations skills, deal architecture skills, and opportunity vision. When all 3 of these capabilities are successfully in motion, you can make an excellent living today and build long-term wealth while creating value for everybody that you touch along the way. Today's show notes are at www.thoughtfulre.com/E14. Please do yourself a big favor and also do us a big favor by hitting the subscribe button in your podcast app. If you would also be so kind as to rate and review the podcast with your honest feedback, it would be very helpful to us as it will help others find the podcast. In the last episode, you may recall that we discussed a concept I call deal feel. Deal feel is the art of keeping a very sensitive finger on the pulse of the various nuanced aspects of an acquisition deal. So go back and listen to that one if you haven't already, because it's a great episode, but also because it leads nicely into today's topic. And in today's main course, we're going to discuss how to renegotiate with a seller based on your due diligence findings. And so this is going to be one of the main parts of your transaction process where having that deal feel is going to be really, really important. But first, a couple announcements and then a little food for thought. There is now a group on Facebook just for us thoughtful real estate entrepreneurs, and it is called, wait for it, Thoughtful Real Estate Entrepreneurs. So head over to Facebook and just search for Thoughtful Real Estate Entrepreneurs in Facebook, and you'll find the group, and just request to join the group. And we are really excited to have you in there for lively discussion on all things related to the unique way that we as trees go about our business in thoughtful real estate. You know, real estate investors get so caught up in which strategy to use, what the
best way to do flipping or wholesaling is, or to make money with this or with that, or the shortcuts and the tips and the techniques. But we often forget that all deals have one thing in common, and that thing is that there's a human on the other end of the transaction, especially when you're doing business the thoughtful way and working directly with sellers. And if you could master the art of working with those people in a way that gets you to a yes that you need from them and gives you both a win, then it's going to transform your entire business. And that's why I've created a brand new webinar that I want to invite you to attend. It's called How to Earn an Incredible Living and Build Lasting Wealth in Real Estate by Mastering the Uncommon Art of Seller Relation Skills without working harder or doing more deals. What you'll learn in this free webinar presentation is primarily based on 3 secrets. Secret number 1 is how to easily uncover the hidden motivations of every seller. Secret number 2 is how to confidently meet face-to-face with the seller and come across as a trustworthy pro. And secret number 3 is how to market to sellers in a way that makes the phone ring and helps you buy properties that nobody else even knows are for sale. So come join us on this free webinar. To register, all you have to do is visit www.sellerrelationsmastery.com, sellerrelationsmastery.com, and we hope to see you on the webinar. All right, time for a little bit of food for thought, as we always like to have a little nibble of something to think on before we jump into our main course. And, that's something we like to do as Trees, thoughtful real estate entrepreneurs. We're always feeding our minds with things to think about. And so today what we're thinking about is a topic of empathy. Now, I really believe empathy is one of the biggest keys to having success with seller relations. And, if you look up empathy in the dictionary, its definition is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. And in our case, the way this translates specifically into the context of our business as thoughtful real estate entrepreneurs is it's the ability to see things from the other person's perspective. And so that other person might be a seller, oftentimes it is. It might be a tenant, it might be a buyer, it might be a wholesale assignee, wholesale buyer. It could be a lot of different parties. But it's important to note that empathy is not the same as sympathy. Sympathy, I looked that up too. The definition of that is understanding between people and a common feeling. And so there's an important difference between empathy, the ability to understand and share the feelings of another, with sympathy. Because sympathy is when you share the same feeling as the other person. And we don't actually have to share the same feelings as the other party, but we do have to be able to understand what those feelings and that perspective is. And I think the hardest part of empathy and the key difference that we need to be able to practice is we have to be able to separate the I understand how you feel side of things from the I agree that you should or should not feel that way side of things. Because if I'm trying to have empathy with you, I need to understand how you're feeling. I don't need to agree with the fact that you're feeling that way, but I do need to be able to at least understand it. And this is what makes it so hard, because it's really difficult to pull apart in our minds understanding how someone feels and believing or agreeing with the fact that they do or don't, and that whether they should or should not actually feel that way. And so it doesn't mean that once you do see things from their perspective, you have to change your mind, your opinion, your perspective, or any of your decisions. It's just that when you're trying to negotiate something and you're trying to reach agreement, you need all of the information and all of the context that you can possibly get your hands on. And this bit of information, what does the situation look like from the other person's perspective, is a huge bit of information. And it would not be smart to try to reach agreement with only part of the information available. So it's important that we do the work needed to get into the other person's shoes, because that is an important piece of information we need. Now, I know this is so much easier said than done. It is for me as well, trust me. It doesn't just happen naturally for most people. We really, when we know we need to have empathy, we really have to almost manually make ourselves step into the position of the other person and their shoes. I have literally in my mind many times, when I realized I needed to have more empathy in a situation, I almost literally pictured myself
taking a step forward and then turning around and looking back at myself and trying to say, if I was them looking at me, what would I be thinking and feeling? Here's a quick story that's kind of an example of this. A few years ago, I sent a letter to a group of owners of small plexes, and the owner of one particular fourplex reached out by sending me an email. And in that email, they told me exactly what they wanted in a transaction if they wanted to sell it. And they said they wanted $550,000 for this property. And they insisted that their sale was going to have to be a contract sale. And as a side note, yes, people do that. Seller financing is not just something we talk people into by any means. Sometimes they absolutely already understand the incredible benefits of it. But that is a side note. So this person said, I want to sell the property. Here's the price. Here's the method and the process, the structure of selling it. And I thought to myself, that this works for me. I could see this working. So I took a drive to see them. It's actually a couple hours away from where I live. And I wrote it up as a deal exactly as they wanted it. And we signed it around. And we went into escrow. And I did my due diligence. And we got through that. And about a week before closing, I got an email unexpectedly from an attorney who was working on the seller's behalf. And the attorney said that the sellers are no longer comfortable with the deal and that they have lots of concerns and probably want to cancel the deal. So I'm really worried and upset at this point. And this deal actually had implications of lots of other things I was working on as well. So I reached out to the sellers myself, and I realized I was going to have to see things from their perspective if I was going to be able to get anywhere with them. So I reached out to them and I suggested we do something that to me almost always seems to help. And I just simply call this pull it apart. Take all of their thoughts, listen closely to all of their thoughts, but instead of it being one big jumble of thoughts, we need to pull it apart and look at each issue one at a time, and instead of that jumble. And so I asked them to explain it all to me, and I just listened closely. And then I worked hard to sort of itemize it, basically break it down into 3 or 4 specific issues on their minds. And then one at a time, we went through each of those issues, and they explained it to me. And I worked hard to put myself in their shoes on that specific and single issue, just one at a time. And then once I understood their perspective, I then had enough context and information to be able to work with them to resolve that concern for each of those things one at a time, either by simply providing more information. Maybe their concern was sort of based on not understanding something. And so I was able to either provide more information, or I was able to actually suggest a little tweak to our deal that would better address a particular issue or concern that they had. So we went through that process. We did it 3 or 4 or 5 times, and we just checked off each list or each item on the list, and they felt really good about it. That got the deal back on track, and we got it closed on time. The thing about empathy is it requires you to take a pause. You have to pause long enough, first of all, to even realize that you need to go through the empathy process. And then you actually have to pause long enough to give yourself the time needed to do exactly that. Because it does take a minute sometimes to manually force your brain to step out of your own perspective and into somebody else's. But when you go back to somebody and you demonstrate that you're seeing things from their perspective and acknowledging their perspective, it's really powerful because they feel heard, they feel understood, and that's just a human need and want that we all have. We want to be felt like we're being heard and understood. So sometimes, in this sense, conflict can actually be something that makes the relationship stronger because it gives you a chance to demonstrate your empathy, which then makes the other person feel even better about your relationship. So that is today's food for thought. And it's a carefully chosen piece of food for thought, a morsel of food for thought at that, because empathy does play a big role in the topic of today's main course. And today's topic is how to renegotiate with a seller based on your due diligence findings. So I want to set the scenario here. I want to provide some context for this conversation. So you've put a property in contract and you've been working directly with the seller to do that. That's how you got to this point. You made your offer, based on all the information that was available to you at that time from the seller, from what you could just see with your own eyes, etc. And in this case, your offer included a contingency for due diligence, which as trees, that's a pretty standard process for us. Maybe we should note that in the world of lowbrow real estate investors, the world of fast cash, as is BS, then there are often contingencies that are just, it's overflowing with contingencies that are basically just escape clauses. But in this case, we're actually talking about a real, sincere desire to do due diligence to make sure that what we're buying or getting ready to assign with a wholesale transaction is indeed what we think it is. So we have written in a contingency for us to have the right, have the time to make sure that it is indeed what we think it is. Reasonable sellers, by the way, never really object to this. They very easily have enough empathy to know that if you're going to spend a ton of money to buy something, you want to at least know what you're buying. So in most cases, sellers, the types of sellers that trees work with, are not objecting to due diligence contingencies. Anyway, back on track. So you do really sincerely want to do this deal. Your offer was made in good faith, and you're not looking for reasons to say no in due diligence. You're actually looking for information to make sure that you're making a good decision, or to even fine-tune the negotiation a little bit, which is a lot of what we're going to discuss today. You did not pull a lowbrow move where you knew there was no way you could actually pay what you were offering, and that there was no way you were going to close on it at this price and terms, and you're just jerking the seller around and kind of getting ready to just stick it to them after due diligence. That's not what's going on here. You've conducted your due diligence, which is often physical inspections. It could be a series of physical inspections, like in addition to regular home inspection, might be sewer scope, it might be a search for an oil tank, it might be a test for radon or some other types of thing, which varies a little bit from market to market and neighborhood to neighborhood. But you've done this inspection or set of inspections with a paid independent third-party home inspector. And this is super important. And we're going to come back and talk about why that is so important in just a minute. In addition to having hired this set of independent third-party inspectors, you may have taken some time to look at zoning codes and building codes and making sure that you understand the property, what it allows, what work has been done on the property so far, if it's been permitted, etc. You've also probably inspected the leases, if there are leases or rental agreements involved. And now, through all this stuff, you really know what it is you're dealing with. Now, in my business, in most cases, I know that I'm going to find some element of new information that I didn't know about before that could change the picture a little bit, if not a lot, but at least a little bit is very common for my due diligence to turn up something that changes the picture a little bit. Some type of physical inspection finding, some type of, issue with the lease or something like that that could change the picture a little bit. Now, sometimes you really do find some truly deal-breaking, truly shocking new information that, either has to be addressed or you're just going to have to terminate. But my findings in my own business are usually more along the scale of minor to medium in severity. And I see this normally as an opportunity to kind of, quote, tighten up the deal. That's actually an expression I use a lot. Tightening up the deal with a little bit of a renegotiation after due diligence. And that's really what today's episode is all about. In this case, the deal is already pretty acceptable, but based on and in light of some new information that you now have from due diligence, which you've collected independently and objectively with third-party professionals, you might be able to make your deal a little bit better through fine-tuning the negotiation on a real, genuine, and continuing to be win-win level and type of approach. So that's what this episode is about. It's how to handle this new information, how to present it, how to discuss it, and perhaps how to renegotiate to some degree with the seller based on those findings. So let's talk now about the seller's perspective on this point and this topic, this point of the transaction, right? So in other words, let's have a little empathy here and think about what the experience of this is like for the seller. So we're going to make some generalizations here, but these are things that I found to be pretty consistent. In the mind of the seller, once they've accepted an offer, they already feel like the property is sold. We discussed that a bit in last week's episode about deal feel, and you'll find sometimes or oftentimes that sellers actually even use the language that implies the deal has closed. They'll say, "Oh, I sold my property," even though it hasn't actually closed yet. They just accepted an offer, but in their mind, it's sold. And they know you're going to do your due diligence, but they're seeing due diligence as a kind of quote, check to make sure everything is as we think it is process. They're not seeing it as a check to see if I want to buy this place. And that's good. Hopefully we've not led them to think that you're just tying the property up so that you can look at it and then decide. We really want them to feel that way, and we want to let them run with that feeling because it's important that they feel like, things are moving forward unless something really unexpected comes up. Now, one of the things that it's really important for us to talk about as it relates to the seller's perspective is the topic of as is. Now, in my own business, I do make most of my offers as is. But what I've found is that sometimes what as is means can be interpreted differently by sellers than by me and what I'm intending when I say that. The lowbrow folks, as is one of the words that we hear from them all the time. And the point I want to make to you is that as is does not by itself make an offer lowbrow because you made an offer as is. But let's just take a moment here to talk about what as is really means, because I have experienced this being a real point of potential disconnect with the seller, and it can become a difficult point to address. So let's just talk about an example. If I offer to buy this house as is for $300,000 with a contingency for inspections and due diligence, okay, and the seller accepts, what does that really mean? So what I found is that oftentimes the seller, what they're hearing is, you've agreed to pay me $300,000 for this house, and that won't change because you're taking the house as is. That's what they hear oftentimes when they hear the words as is. So to them, they're thinking that, the house is imperfect and the house has issues, and you're willing to pay $300,000 with the knowledge that it's imperfect. Okay, so that's their perspective on this topic of as is often. But what I feel like, what I'm really saying is, I'm going to make this sale easy for you, and I'm not going to be asking you to fix anything before closing. That's what as is means. I will take the property as it currently is. But the $300,000 that I've offered is based on what I currently know about the house today. And I need to do my due diligence to make sure that I know what I'm actually buying and that there aren't any surprises lurking. And if I do find something unexpected, then I'll still take the house as is. But at this point, the is different than what I originally thought it was when I made my first offer. So in other words, if you look at this difference in perspective on as is from the buyer's perspective and the seller's perspective, in other words, the seller often feels that you don't have the right to renegotiate with me because you said you were buying the house as is. But what we as the buyer are saying is, as is means I'm not going to ask you to fix anything, but I still need to know what the is in as is actually is. As is great, but I have to do my due diligence to understand exactly what the current state of affairs is, and I will take the property in its current state of affairs. But if the current state of affairs is different than what I thought it was based on our initial conversations and what I can see and what you've told me, then we're going to have to address that as well. I found that this can be a major disconnect sometimes, and it causes big problems. And if it's not handled correctly, the seller may feel like you baited and switched them, right? That you said you'd pay $300,000, but you never had any sincere intent of doing that. And that's not good, because once they start to feel that way, then the relationship is starting to snowball in the wrong direction. And so we really want to preempt that by letting them know that as is means you do want to buy the property in its current state, but you do have to make sure that you understand what that current state is. And if the current state turns out to be different than you think it is, then you'll just have to have that conversation and cross that bridge if you come to it. After recently having one of these disconnects with a seller and her not understanding it in the way that I intended for her to understand it, I was trying to think of an analogy that I was preparing to use with her to help convey what it was I was trying to say. And the analogy I came up with is a little bit silly and it's a little bit extreme, but it does make the point, I believe. So if I were to offer to buy someone's used car as is, I'm going to buy this used car as is for $5,000. But before I want to buy it, I want my friend who's a mechanic, I want him to come over and take a look at the car for me, right? And the seller accepts. So this is an offer that is conditioned upon due diligence, basically, as is for $5,000. The seller accepts. So if my friend, who's the mechanic, comes over, takes a look at the car and says, Jeff, this car doesn't have brakes, okay? I would go back to the seller and I would say, look, hey seller, I'm still interested in buying your car, but I can't really pay $5,000 anymore because I discovered in my due diligence that it doesn't have any brakes and I'm going to have to obviously install brakes. It doesn't seem likely that the seller is going to get mad and yell at me and say, but you committed to paying $5,000 for it as is. Obviously, I've now discovered something unexpected that was undisclosed that is significant in terms of the value of the car. And I'm still interested in buying the car, but I can't buy it for $5,000 in light of this new information. And it doesn't seem likely that the seller would look at me like I was crazy for saying, hey, I'm going to need a discount on the car, given the fact that I now know it doesn't have brakes. And for some reason, though, in real estate, this is more convoluted. In that car example, I can't imagine the seller of the car getting mad at me for wanting an adjustment based on some shocking new findings. But in real estate, oftentimes it can be that way. And the seller can become upset that you found something and you must need to now change the deal in a way that reflects this new reality. So this brings us to the topic of how is it that we best present our findings from due diligence in a way that is going to facilitate the best possible conversation and allow us to successfully have a little renegotiation. So when you're presenting your findings, the key to the setup of this is you need to frame the situation in the following way. It needs to come across to the sellers like this. Seller, in my due diligence, the inspectors that I hired gave me some new information that neither you nor I were previously aware of, and neither of us could possibly have known about. Okay, now you might say that literally if you want to verbatim, but if nothing else, at least you need to frame the situation in that particular way. And this is really, really key for three kind of main reasons. Number one is you're setting the table here to explain why a change is needed. Because there is now new information, new being the key part here. There is now new information that you didn't know about when you first made your offer. And so when you frame it in this way, now they can't possibly suggest that you've baited and switched them because you gave your best effort and your best offer at the time based on what you knew, but now you know more and different things. So reason number one, it's really important to do this type of framing is because you're now showing there's new information, and now that means there has to be a new conversation. Secondly, you're positioning this new information not as your own information, not as your own opinion, not as your own findings, but new information, findings, and opinions provided by independent professionals, not you, independent people. So now you have a situation where you've intentionally created a dynamic where if the seller is upset with anybody, they're not upset with you because you didn't go in and create the report on the inspection findings yourself. The professional inspector did. So if they're disappointed or upset with anybody, it's now not aimed at you. It's aimed at the inspector. And the third reason is you're nicely pre-framing this situation with a subtle message that says, seller, it's not your fault that this property is in bad shape. You couldn't have known. You're not a professional contractor, a professional inspector, an engineer, or a plumber. This isn't a reflection of you. It's not something that has come as a result of your mismanagement of the property or that you unethically withheld from me. You could not possibly have known that XYZ was wrong either. And without this very, very deliberate pre-frame like this, these findings that you're about to present can easily be taken as a personal attack on the seller themselves. The seller can see it as you basically pointing the finger at them saying, you haven't managed the place well, you haven't maintained it well, you showed poor ethics in what you disclosed or did not disclose to me. So for those three reasons, it's very, very important that you frame this whole situation that, seller, in my due diligence, the inspectors gave me some new information that neither you nor I were previously aware of or could even reasonably have possibly known. So what this means is that you're now presenting information about a new reality. This is a new reality about the property that is a shock to both of you. Neither of you were expecting this new reality. Neither of you could possibly have known it. And you're both equally disappointed to learn it. Now, they're disappointed because all this stuff is going to be telling them that their property is not worth as much as they thought it was. But through this positioning, you're communicating that you're just as disappointed to learn it as well, because you're excited about this property. You want to own a property in great condition, and you're just as disappointed to learn about these shortcomings as well. But this new reality is just that. It's a reality, and we can't really deny reality. So what this means is this new reality and the property issues that comprise this new reality is the common enemy of both of you. It's not you versus the seller pitted against each other in a negotiation or a debate. It's you and the seller together pitted against the reality as the enemy. It's you and the seller sitting on the same side of the table looking at the new reality and saying, okay, how can we defeat this? The information is the enemy, not the other person. The inspector is almost like the enemy. So I hope you're starting to see why having an outside third-party inspector is so important, because their opinion is their opinion. And it's not you who's judging their property and deciding this property is good or bad or anything else. It's a third party who doesn't really have a vested interest in the outcome. So you've now created on purpose somebody who you can point the burden and the blame at, which then keeps the vibe more positive between you and the seller. Subconsciously, the seller knows that they can't be mad at you for this new information. You're just the messenger. Subconsciously, they realize they can't shoot you as the messenger because you've discovered some unfortunate news. It's not like you went and, rusted the galvanized plumbing out to the point where it's almost useless. They know that. And so subtly, you are reminding them that you're just the messenger and the information is the thing that they should be disappointed about. This doesn't mean now that they're going to be excited, to hear that there's a problem. They're not going to, because of your great job framing this, they're not going to go, oh, I'm so glad to hear that the foundation is crumbling. But they are going to be mad at the problem, not mad at you. And this is so important when it comes to then taking the steps to renegotiate or revise your deal in a way that continues to work for both of you. So the obstacle here that the new reality is the enemy. It's not that the other person is the enemy. The seller's not seeing you as the enemy. You're not seeing them as the enemy. You're saying, boy, this new reality is unfortunately the enemy that we need to work. And the flip side of that is you're both also kind of equally the victim of this new reality, right? And I actually hate talking about wanting to come across as a victim because that's really the opposite of what thoughtful real estate entrepreneurs, think of themselves as. But the point is, you're both just as equally disappointed to get this new news. You're both as bummed out and concerned about what it means. But that also means that you now are set up to have a perfect collaborative approach to resolving this little issue. And the message here is whether it's subtly and unstated, or whether, again, you actually might literally say this verbatim. But the good news, Mr. Seller, is that you have a property you still want to sell. You have a property I still want to buy. So let's just find a way to work together to deal with this new reality. I'm sure that if we put our heads together, we can find a way that works for both of us to get past this. It positions you as both being on the same team, sitting on the same side of the table, metaphorically speaking. And it suggests the optimism that we can get past this obstacle. Now that we've discovered this unfortunate new reality, we can't pretend it's not a reality, but I'm sure that we can find a way to work together to get something figured out. So you want to start with this process with your own preparation. And it's really important to start with the end in mind. This is way before you're sitting down with the seller to have this conversation. You want to start with the end in mind. Now that you've done your due diligence and you understand what's going on with the property, it's important that you start with the end in mind. So what is it that you ideally want to have happen from this meeting? What is the outcome that you would like to steer this conversation towards? How exactly would you like to see this deal change, have it get better, or otherwise sort of, quote, tightened up, the expression that I like to use? You're going to want to gather up all of the written documentation of your due diligence findings that you possibly can get. That's why it's so important that all of the information you gather is documented somehow in writing. And you're going to want to print all that stuff out and have it at the ready in your notebook. Now, it's very important to note you're not going to necessarily share all of it, and you're not going to just come and drop a huge stack of paper on the table with the seller. But if you need it to reference or to provide as evidence in this conversation, you want to make sure that it's at the ready. It's really important that this is independent, credible, third-party documentation, because that's what makes it real. That's what makes it not just hearsay from the seller's perspective. They know that you spent money to get this information, and that these are licensed independent professionals without any vested interest in the outcome. So then you're going to want to write a simple one-page summary. I like to create just a line-by-line item summary that itemizes out each of the issues that really came up in due diligence that we didn't know about before. And I want to present all of these unexpected things, but I want to show them that I'm also not expecting them to take care of all of these unexpected things to come out. So I write out this list of unexpected findings, and I want that list to be long. I want it visually to look like, oh my gosh, that's a long list of things that came up. And here's the reason. Because next to each one of these things, I'm either going to put an expected cost to each, or I'm going to write the words buyer to handle this next to it. And I want the list to be long because I want the majority of these items to have the words buyer to handle this next to it. That way, they can see visually, without even really digesting the gist of the items on the list, they can look and see that's a long list without even reading it. It looks like a long list, but also without even really reading it, 65% of the things on this list have the words buyer to handle this written next to it. So visually, they can see that you're taking care of a majority of the items. And I think that's very important from a psychological perspective, because they're already feeling, without digesting these things, that you are not being nitpicky, that you are being thorough in the identification of all these things, but you're not being nitpicky. You're not going to sort of peck them to death by ducks kind of an approach, nickel and dime them. It conveys, without you saying anything, that you're being fair, you're being more than fair, and you're looking to make a compromise. So here's what I say. when I go to share this with them, I sit down and I say, look, I always expect to find some unexpected things. That's the nature of my business. I know some unexpected stuff is going to come up. And so I plan for that. I accommodate that. I know that that's going to come up. I don't know what the things are going to be, but I know something unexpected is going to arise. But there are a few unexpected things from my due diligence that came up that truly are honestly beyond the scope of what I was anticipating could arise. And those are the things that I wanted to sit down and chat with you about today, and to see if we could find a way to handle or accommodate these topics. Then with the seller, I go through every single item on the list, no matter how kind of small it is. And if the list is long, this is going to take a few minutes for you to go through it. And that's, again, part of the point, is that of this long list, you're actually suggesting that you're going to handle the majority of these things, a lot of which are small things, but you're just reserving a few of the bigger things to really talk with them about. So again, I read through every single item on the list. I further reinforce the fact that I'm actually handling most of this list for them. And at this point, if I'm feeling at all like I see them wavering, if I'm reading their body language and it seems like they're getting uncomfortable, I will often plant a seed in their minds by saying something like this. I hired a regular home inspector to conduct all of these inspection items. And these are all normal standard inspection items. It's safe to say that this set of findings is exactly what any other buyer would find in their due diligence as well. And this is an important message because it plants a seed that makes the seller feel like if they were to decline, to work with you to address any of these issues in favor of just starting over, right? If they were to just let the deal die because they weren't willing to work with you and start over, that would probably be a bad idea, because a new buyer is going to come along and the new buyer is going to do the same standard due diligence, and the same standard home inspectors are going to find the same standard findings here. And they're going to find themselves having the same conversation in the future, but having lost time along the way. So you want the seller to be thinking, it looks like I'm going to have to address all this stuff eventually anyway. I could either do it now and just be done with it, or I could find myself having this same conversation like deja vu 5 weeks from now and have the outcome be no different, but it's just later and I've lost more time and money as a result. You can do this confidently and you can feel good about this because it's the honest to goodness truth that you did do thorough but pretty standard inspection and due diligence, and you do sincerely believe that if the seller were to sell the property to somebody else who was going to also do a respectable job of due diligence, that they'd come up with a lot of the same concerns later. And in almost all cases, I am not asking them to fix these issues for me. Again, that's what as is means to me, and it's what I've conveyed to them it means. I'm also, and I am happy to remind them of this, I, as a real estate professional, as an entrepreneur, I'm set up to get work done probably better than they are. I have my subs lined up. They respond to me. I know how to work with these people, whereas the seller is normally then kind of starting from scratch, finding subs for different projects. So I remind them, look, I don't need you to fix this particular problem. I'm happy to take care of it myself, but the truth is, it is a reality that's going to affect me and cost me money that I wasn't anticipating spending. So instead, that means, of course, I'm mostly just asking them for an adjustment to the price or to the terms of the deal potentially, instead of the price, or some combination thereof, to accommodate this new reality. And I almost always have a very specific proposal in my mind of what I think is fair that I'm going to be ready to suggest to them, usually a very specific adjustment to the price or to the terms. And I also always go into this meeting knowing to myself, I just keep it to myself, but I always know what would I actually be willing to live with if they don't go for the main proposal. So I might go into this meeting knowing that I am presenting a lot of due diligence findings that I'm actually proposing results in a $5,000 credit. But in my mind, I know that I'm going to ask for $5,000, but if I could get them to give me $2,500, then I would be able to live with that. So again, just like starting with the end in mind, it's important to know what you want and what you could live with, what you'd be willing to accept before you actually get into this meeting. So what is the seller's mindset about this experience? Well, again, this is back to our topic of empathy, isn't it? If due diligence is the only contingency of your offer, which in most cases means your offer did not also have a financing contingency. If due diligence is the only contingency of your offer, then this seller knows that if they simply agree to what you're asking for, then they're moving forward towards closing. And there's probably an increasingly reasonable degree of certainty in their mind that this deal is indeed going to get closed. So it makes them want to lean towards just saying yes to keep things moving forward. I know when I'm the seller of a property, that's how I feel too. I don't always love the repair addendums and the adjustments and things that come back when a buyer has done their due diligence and they're asking to work for me to work with them to adjust the deal. But I also know that I really don't want to be starting over. And if I just say yes, I'm moving forward. And again, if you've done your job well, the seller is feeling like if they say no and have to start over with that new buyer, then the new buyer is just going to come up with all the same concerns anyway. And then they'll just be back at the same spot, but having lost several weeks for no real reason in the meantime. Furthermore, by demonstrating your fair approach to compromise in the face of these unexpected challenges, which you are doing by showing that you're going to handle the majority of the unexpected things that came up, it really honestly can actually strengthen your relationship with them because, again, you're demonstrating to them that you are being fair. And these things often work in your favor and help you get the deal done. Now, I do need to give you a disclaimer. There is a wild card when it comes to renegotiating with sellers. And the wild card is that people are human. And sometimes we humans are unreasonable, and sometimes we are unrealistic. So what this strategy does is it sets you up to have the highest possible chance of success when working with reasonable people because you've built a logical argument. You've taken the emotion out of it. You've positioned the new information that you've got, this new reality, as a shock to both of you. You've presented a solution that shows that you compromise and are willing to work with the seller and involves you handling a lot, as much if not more of the unexpected stuff that came up as you're asking the seller to handle. But there's always the wild card that the seller is simply not a reasonable person or reasonable in that moment or being rational and being realistic. There are people who will say, I understand this 30-year tenured engineer says the foundation needs to be replaced, but he doesn't know what he's talking about. Those people exist. I've met them. And there are people who will say, yes, I know the house is only worth $300,000 if it has a functional roof, but I'm just not willing to adjust the price to reflect that $15,000 roofing job. Okay, well, those people exist, and these are the same people who might say something like, I realize that if I drop a tennis ball, it will hit the ground, but when I step off this cliff, I'm pretty sure that I'm not going to end up at the bottom of the ravine. Okay, whatever you say. People cannot always be counted on to be rational and realistic. And if you're rational and realistic sometimes doesn't mean you're always rational and realistic. So that is the wild card. That is the disclaimer. But by following this process of preparing for renegotiation and framing the situation as independent third-party information that is the common enemy of both you and the seller, but that showing that you're willing to work with them and provided a proposed solution on how to get past this hurdle that you too are just as disappointed to have learned about. You're really set up to have your best chance of success getting your deal renegotiated or tightened up. But unfortunately, sometimes deals will die because some people are just not being realistic. It's just part of the game. So in summary, oftentimes your due diligence does turn up new information that has to be factored in. It has to be considered because it was not reflected in your original initial agreement with the seller. And as always, as a thoughtful real estate entrepreneur, you want to conduct yourself with integrity and honesty. and seek a win-win with the seller. You're not doing due diligence to gather up a bunch of evidence to then go and railroad somebody. If you conduct yourself with empathy and you conduct this process with strategy and you communicate clearly and logically, the meeting that you have to do this renegotiation can really be a powerful turning point in your deal and can really help you tighten it up and make it the best it possibly can be going into closing. The ability that you have and you develop to conduct this process is such an important part of the seller relations process and the skill set overall. And as a reminder, if you want to keep working towards mastering the art of seller relations, go to sellerrelationsmastery.com and sign up for our free webinar. Thanks again for listening to yet another episode of Sleaze-Free Real Estate Investing. On the next episode, we're going to be discussing the beginning of an ongoing conversation about how thoughtful real estate entrepreneurs approach rental properties and why we love them so much. And here's a hint. They are the key to building wealth in our way of thinking and doing business. So again, please do yourself and do us a big favor by hitting the subscribe button in your podcast app and rating and reviewing the podcast with your honest feedback. You'll know when the next episode comes out immediately because you'll be subscribed and you'll also be helping others find the podcast. Reminder, today's show notes, including a transcript, can be found at www.thoughtfulre.com/E14. And until next time, this is Jeff from the Thoughtful Real Estate Entrepreneur signing off.
Thanks for listening to Sleaze-Free Real Estate Investing. Remember, solve the person to unlock the deal and solve the financing to unlock the profits.